Ask most Punjabis where their ancestors came from, and you'll get a confident answer. Some will say their bloodline traces back to the ancient Vedic seers who composed the earliest hymns of the Rig Veda on the banks of the Indus and its tributaries. Others will point to the Sikh warriors who defended Punjab against invading empires for centuries. Others still trace their lineage to noble Rajput clans, or to the Mughal courts, or to the Islamic conquerors who once ruled from Lahore. Almost none of them, if you ask a geneticist, will give you the full answer. Punjab has never lacked for origin stories. It is one of the most fought-over, migrated through, and mythologized regions on the entire subcontinent. A fertile plain fed by 5 great rivers, sitting directly in the path of nearly every major army, empire, and migration that ever moved between Central Asia and the Indian heartland. Alexander's soldiers crossed it. Persian satraps administered it. Vedic composers sang about it. Mughal emperors fought over it. British colonial officers called it the breadbasket of their Indian empire. Sikh gurus built a new faith on its soil, and in 1947 it was split violently in two, the single bloodiest partition line drawn anywhere on the subcontinent. Given all of that, it should come as no surprise that when scientists finally went looking for a single, clean origin story in Punjab's DNA, they didn't find one. What they found instead was something layered, complicated, and in several respects, more revealing than any single legend ever could be. Because when scientists finally sat down and sequenced the DNA of Punjabi communities, Jat Sikhs, Hindu Jats, Muslim Jats, Khatris, Aroras, Rajputs, and Gujars alike, what they found was a genetic history so layered, so surprising, and so quietly unifying across religious lines that it forced researchers to rewrite the story of where Punjab's people actually came from. The real answer is not simple. It is not something that fits comfortably into a single national myth, a single religious narrative, or a single ancient kingdom. It is the story of at least 3 separate waves of ancient migration, arriving thousands of years apart, colliding on the same fertile plain between 5 rivers, and leaving behind a genetic signature written so clearly into modern Punjabi DNA that scientists can still read it today, thousands of years later. This is the real genetic origin of the Punjabi people, and it is almost certainly not what you think. To understand where this story begins, you have to go back roughly 9,000 years to the earliest farming communities that took root along the floodplains of the Indus River and its tributaries, the rivers that would eventually give Punjab its name, meaning, quite literally, the land of 5 waters. These early agricultural communities, ancestors of what would eventually become the Indus Valley Civilization, carried a genetic profile deeply rooted in South Asia itself, blended with early farming populations that had migrated in from the Iranian plateau many centuries earlier. This ancient lineage is preserved today in a Y chromosome marker known as haplogroup L, still found at strikingly high frequencies, often between 30 and 37%, in specific Jat clans across Punjab, including well-known lineages like the Sandhu, Gill, and Dhillon clans. This is not a minor genetic footnote. It represents a direct paternal thread connecting millions of Punjabis alive today to the farmers who built one of the world's first great urban civilizations, over 4,000 years before anyone in the region had ever heard of Sikhism, Hinduism, or Islam. That was the first wave. The second wave arrived later, and it changed everything. Beginning roughly 4,000 years ago and continuing over the following centuries, a new population began moving into the northwestern subcontinent from the Central Asian steppe, the vast grasslands stretching from modern-day Kazakhstan through southern Russia. These migrants carried a genetic lineage now instantly recognizable to population geneticists, the Y chromosome haplogroup R1A, specifically its Z93 subclade, a paternal lineage that traces back to the same Bronze Age steppe populations responsible for spreading Indo-European languages across much of Europe and Asia. When this ancient wave of migration reached Punjab, it left behind one of the most concentrated genetic footprints found anywhere on the subcontinent. Modern studies of Jat Sikh populations have found R1A Z93 frequencies reaching as high as 55 to 65%, among the highest concentrations of this specific paternal lineage documented anywhere in South Asia, rivaled only by certain Brahmin communities from the same broader region. Layered on top of the Y chromosome data, autosomal studies, meaning DNA inherited from both parents, not just the paternal line, tell the same story from a different angle. Punjabi populations, and Jat communities in particular, carry some of the highest concentrations of what researchers call steppe-related ancestry, found anywhere in India, typically estimated between 25 and 35%. When combined with the broader ancestral North Indian component, the deeper genetic signal linking Punjab to ancient populations across Iran, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, Punjabi communities show an ANI ancestry proportion reaching 62 to 76%, among the highest recorded for any population group on the entire subcontinent. Read that carefully, because this is where the real shock begins. A majority, in many Jat communities, a clear and substantial majority, of the paternal genetic lineage carried by Punjabis today traces back not to the ancient farmers of the Indus Valley, and not to some unbroken indigenous South Asian bloodline stretching back tens of thousands of years, but to migrants who arrived from Central Asia and the Iranian plateau within roughly the last 4,000 years. In genetic terms, that is remarkably recent. It is a blink of an eye compared to the tens of thousands of years modern humans have inhabited South Asia. But the story does not end there. And this is the part that even researchers found genuinely fascinating once they looked closely at the data from a different genetic lens entirely. Maternal ancestry, passed down through mitochondrial DNA from mother to daughter, generation after generation, completely independent of the paternal Y chromosome record. When scientists examined the maternal lineages of Punjabi populations, including Khatri and Jat communities, they found something strikingly different from the paternal story. The overwhelming majority of Punjabi maternal DNA, in many studies, 60 to 80% or more, belongs to deeply ancient South Asian lineages, particularly a maternal haplogroup known as M, along with its ancient subclades M3 and M30, lineages that geneticists estimate emerged somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 years ago among some of the very earliest modern human populations to settle the Indian subcontinent after the migration out of Africa. West Eurasian maternal lineages, the kind you might expect if Steppe or Iranian migrants had arrived in large, balanced numbers of both men and women, appear in only a small fraction of Punjabi maternal DNA, typically estimated at just 3 to 7%. This is the real genetic origin story of the Punjabi people, and it is written in the mismatch between these two separate genetic records. The paternal line points overwhelmingly toward relatively recent migration from Central Asia and Iran. The maternal line points overwhelmingly toward deep, ancient, indigenous South Asian roots stretching back tens of thousands of years. Put those two findings side by side, and a clear historical pattern emerges, one that population geneticists refer to as sex-biased admixture. Waves of incoming men, arriving from Central Asia and the Iranian plateau over the course of several centuries, settled among and had children with local South Asian women whose own maternal ancestry had been rooted in this land since long before the Indus Valley Civilization even existed. Generation after generation, that pattern repeated until the modern Punjabi genetic profile emerged, a population whose fathers' fathers' fathers trace back largely to Bronze Age steppe migrants, and whose mothers' mothers' mothers trace back to some of the oldest continuously present human lineages found anywhere in South Asia. This same sex-biased pattern, men from one population, women from another, repeated over generations until it becomes a defining feature of an entire people's ancestry, is not unique to Punjab. Population geneticists have documented similar patterns in colonial-era Latin America, in parts of medieval Europe following Viking and Norman conquests, and in Central Asia following various nomadic conquests of settled agricultural societies. What makes the Punjabi case particularly striking is the clarity and consistency of the signal, and just how long ago it was established. This is not a 500-year-old colonial-era pattern still fresh enough to appear in family oral history. This is a 4,000-year-old demographic event, so deeply embedded in the region's genetic architecture that it remains clearly measurable in the DNA of people living in Punjab today, whether in Ludhiana, Amritsar, Lahore, or Faisalabad. That pattern of incoming migration did not stop after the Bronze Age either. Historical and genetic evidence both point to a third significant wave of migration into Punjab, this time occurring much later, somewhere between the 4th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, as new groups moved in from the Central Asian and Iranian frontier regions and settled across the Punjabi plains, gradually adopting the language, customs, and agricultural lifestyle of the communities already established there. Historians and geneticists studying this period believe that many of the clans now closely associated with Punjab's Jat, Rajput, and Gujar communities descend, at least in part, from this later migratory wave, meaning the genetic story of Punjab was not a single dramatic arrival followed by thousands of years of undisturbed continuity, but a repeated, layered process of new populations arriving, settling, and blending into the existing genetic landscape, century after century, for roughly 4,000 years running. Here is where the story becomes genuinely surprising in a way that cuts directly against how many people today understand their own community's history. When researchers compared the genetic profiles of Hindu Jats, Sikh Jats, and Muslim Jats, three communities that modern religious and political history often treats as entirely separate populations, shaped by centuries of religious division, conversion, and in some cases, outright conflict. They found something remarkable. These three religiously distinct communities are, genetically speaking, nearly identical. The same dominant haplogroups, the same approximate steppe ancestry proportions, the same ANI-ASI ratios, the same broad autosomal profile, Religion, it turns out, changed what these communities believed, how they worshipped, what they ate, and in many cases, who they were permitted to marry going forward. But it did not meaningfully change their underlying genetic ancestry, because that ancestry had already been established centuries before Sikhism was founded in the 15th century, and in most cases, centuries before Islam ever arrived in the region at all. The Jat identity, in other words, predates the religious categories that modern observers often assume define it. That finding carries an even more striking implication once you place it alongside the story of the 1947 partition, the event that violently split Punjab in two, uprooting millions of people and drawing a new international border directly through the heart of a single, ancient, genetically continuous population. Researchers studying Jat-Sikh genetic profiles on both sides of that new border reached a conclusion that should, by now, feel familiar. A Jat-Sikh family from Lahore and a Jat-Sikh family from Amritsar were, and remain today, genetically indistinguishable from one another. The border drawn in 1947 did not create a new genetic boundary. It cut directly through the middle of a population whose ancestry, shaped by farmers from the Indus Valley, migrants from the Bronze Age steppe, and later arrivals from Central Asia and Iran, had already been fused together for thousands of years before any modern nation staked a claim to this land. There's another Punjabi community whose genetic story adds an important layer to this picture: the Khatris and Auroras. Historically, Punjab's dominant merchant and trading castes, communities that produced generations of Sikh gurus, poets, and civic leaders across the region. Genetic studies of Khatri populations reveal a profile that overlaps substantially with Jat-Sikhs, but with one notable difference. Khatris show somewhat lower frequencies of the R1a lineage compared to Jat-Sikhs, alongside a noticeably higher frequency of haplogroup J2, a paternal lineage strongly associated with ancient populations from the Iranian plateau and the broader Fertile Crescent. Researchers studying this pattern believe it reflects Khatri and Aurora communities' historic role as Punjab's trading and administrative class, a position that likely brought them into closer, more sustained genetic contact with merchants, officials, and settlers arriving from Persia and the wider Iranian world over the centuries, layered on top of the same ancient steppe and Indus Valley ancestry shared with their Jat neighbors. Maternal DNA studies of Khatri populations tell the now familiar story. Overwhelmingly indigenous South Asian, dominated by the same ancient haplogroup M lineages found across nearly every Punjabi community, regardless of caste, clan, or historical trade profession. Layer onto this genetic record the long list of empires and armies that marched through Punjab across the centuries that followed the original Bronze Age migrations, and the full complexity of the region's ancestry becomes even clearer. Alexander the Great's armies crossed the Indus into Punjab in 326 BCE, leaving behind Indo-Greek kingdoms that endured in the northwest for generations. Kushan emperors, descended from Central Asian nomadic groups, ruled over Punjab and the broader northwestern subcontinent for centuries, beginning around the 1st century of the Common Era. Later, Huna invaders swept down from Central Asia in the 5th and 6th centuries, contributing to that same later wave of migration that historians and geneticists now associate with the rise of many of Punjab's prominent Rajput, Jat, and Gujar clans. Each of these historical waves left behind archaeological and textual evidence of contact and settlement, and modern genetic science has, in study after study, found the biological fingerprints to match, confirming that Punjab's position as one of history's great crossroads was never simply a matter of trade passing through. It was a matter of people arriving, settling, marrying, and staying, century after century, for the better part of 4,000 years. It's worth pausing on just how unusual this genetic story is, even within the broader context of South Asian population history. Most regions of India show a genetic gradient that shifts gradually as you move from north to south, higher steppe and ANI ancestry in the northwest, gradually decreasing as you travel toward the Dravidian-speaking south. Punjab sits at the very extreme end of that entire gradient, carrying some of the highest concentrations of steppe-related ancestry documented anywhere on the subcontinent, higher in most studies than neighboring regions like Haryana, Rajasthan, or the broader northern plains around Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. In population genetics terms, Punjab isn't simply North Indian. It sits at the genetic frontier of the entire subcontinent, closer in ancestry composition to certain populations across the modern border in Pakistan than to communities living just a few hundred kilometers further into peninsular India. This layered genetic history also carries a quiet but significant implication for how both India and Pakistan think about Punjabi identity within their own national narratives. In India, Punjabi Jat and Sikh communities are sometimes framed in popular and political discourse as descendants of a particularly pure or unbroken Vedic or Aryan lineage, distinct from surrounding populations. In Pakistan, Punjabi Muslim identity is sometimes framed around a narrative of descent from Arab, Persian, or Central Asian conquerors and settlers, distancing modern identity from the region's pre-Islamic past. The genetic evidence complicates both narratives in the same direction. There was no single unbroken lineage, Vedic or otherwise, arriving fully formed and untouched by later migration. And there was no wholesale genetic replacement brought about by later Islamic conquest either. Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh Punjabis today remain, at the genetic level, drawn from the same deep well of ancestry, regardless of which century their particular family's religious conversion took place. The DNA doesn't validate either national myth cleanly. It offers something more complicated and arguably more interesting. A single, continuous population, repeatedly layered by new arrivals, that religious and political history later divided into separate stories running in opposite directions. This growing body of genetic research has practical stakes beyond historical curiosity, too. India's National Genome India project and similar sequencing initiatives in Pakistan have both prioritized better mapping the genetic diversity of Punjabi populations specifically, partly because the region's unusually high steppe and Iranian-related ancestry components carry distinct implications for disease risk prediction. Drug metabolism research and hereditary condition screening, medical questions that a genetic profile built primarily from European reference data simply cannot answer accurately for a population with Punjab's particular ancestral mix. Every new study addressing these questions keeps circling back to the same layered picture. An ancient Indus Valley base, a dominant Bronze Age steppe paternal signature, a later Central Asian and Iranian contribution, and, running beneath all of it, one of the oldest continuously present maternal lineages found anywhere in South Asia. None of this erases the real, lived cultural and religious history that shapes Punjabi identity today. The Sikh tradition, founded by Guru Nanak in the 15th century, the centuries of Mughal rule, the arrival of Islam, the resistance movements, the language, the poetry, the music, the food, all of that is genuinely, meaningfully Punjabi, built by real people across real centuries of lived history. Genetic ancestry doesn't compete with that story. It sits underneath it, like bedrock beneath a city, shaping the terrain, but not dictating the architecture built on top of it. But the genetic record does offer something that no religious text, no oral tradition, and no national narrative ever could: a precise, measurable, thousands of years, deep account of exactly which ancient populations combined to create the Punjab of today. Not one origin story, but at least three, layered on top of one another like sediment. Ancient Indus Valley farmers whose Y chromosome lineage still runs through specific Jat clans today. Bronze Age, steppe migrants whose R1a Z93 lineage now dominates the paternal ancestry of Jat Sikh communities, and a much later wave of Central Asian and Iranian migration that arrived over 1,000 years after that, contributing yet another layer to the same genetic landscape. And running underneath every one of these paternal migrations, largely undisturbed for tens of thousands of years, sits an ancient maternal lineage connecting nearly every Punjabi family alive, today back to some of the very first human communities to ever settle in South Asia. That is the real genetic origin of the Punjabi people. Not a single proud bloodline stretching back unbroken to one ancient source, as so many national and religious narratives like to claim, but a genuinely layered, genuinely mixed, genuinely ancient population, built from at least three distinct migratory waves spanning nearly 9,000 years, unified not by a shared myth of singular origin, but by the simple, quiet biological fact that these different ancestral threads have now been woven together for so long that they define what it actually means, at the level of the genome, to be Punjabi. That is also perhaps the most useful thing this kind of research can offer a region that has spent the better part of a century locked in disputes over whose version of history is the correct one. The genome does not care about partition. It does not distinguish between a gurdwara, a mandir, and a mosque. It carries no memory of 1947, no record of which army held which fort in which century, no allegiance to any modern flag. What it carries instead is a plain, testable record of who arrived, when, and who they had children with once they got there. A record that, in Punjab's case, describes not a single triumphant bloodline, but an unusually well-documented example of exactly how human populations have always formed everywhere on Earth, through repeated contact, repeated mixing, and repeated settlement, layered slowly over thousands of years until the result becomes simply a people. There's a broader lesson here that extends well past Punjab, one worth sitting with before this story ends. Nearly every population on Earth that imagines itself as descending from a single, pure, unbroken ancestral line is, when the genetic data is finally examined closely enough, revealed to be something closer to what Punjab turned out to be, a layered composite built from multiple ancient migrations, repeatedly mixed together over centuries or millennia, until the memory of those separate origins fades from oral history and gets replaced by a simpler, cleaner founding myth. Punjab is not unusual in having a mixed genetic history. Punjab is simply unusual in how well documented, how thoroughly studied, and how clearly datable that mixed history has become, thanks to decades of dedicated population genetics research focused specifically on this corridor of the subcontinent. Most populations carry a similarly layered story. Few have had it reconstructed with this much scientific precision. For scientists, that is the shocking result buried inside the DNA of Punjab. Not that Punjabis descend from outsiders, and not that they are somehow less indigenous than they believe themselves to be. The maternal record alone proves an ancient, unbroken South Asian presence, stretching back tens of thousands of years. The genuine surprise is how clearly and how precisely modern genetic science can now trace the layered history of migration, conquest, settlement, and mixing that created one of South Asia's most distinctive and genetically well-documented populations. A history written not in any single book, empire, or religious tradition, but in the DNA itself, carried forward silently, generation after generation, long before anyone thought to ask where it truly came from.